welcome everyone. I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. Really excited to have you all with us today and to be continuing our spring 2021 Friday Forum series called the Digital Misshaping and Shaping of the World. We've had a few really great talks in this series so far, and we're really excited to continue that for today. So to set the scene a little bit for anyone who might be new to Friday Forum is a weekly lecture series held every semester here at the University Y that strives to raise awareness about national and international trends and events, and really just provide a space to talk about different topics of relevance and urgency that's around in our society. Some of our past series have looked at a variety of things using art as activism, environmental justice. Last semester, we looked at the current state of our democracy and many, many other topics and important conversations. So we're really excited to be able to continue that and to really talk about technology this semester and talk about the way that it is currently really taking a hold of our lives, especially during the pandemic and in light of everything that's been happening. In the chat, I am quickly going to send a list of our amazing sponsors for the series. We would not be able to be putting this on without the support of all of the people listed here, as well as all of you have come and really just supported and participated in Friday Forum. So thank you to everyone. If you're interested in learning how you could be a supporter and sponsor for the series, definitely reach out and let us know. So to talk a little bit more about this semester in particular and what we're going to be looking into today, in the midst of a pandemic, many of us are using technology in more ways than we ever have before, and in more times than we ever have before. The world of technology really opens many doors for global connection, but it also comes with some consequences and some things that we have to consider. With growing digital interactions, there's a greater need to understand the intersections between things like technology and race, class, privacy, faith, public health, and so many others. And how these intersections impact our everyday lives are really important for us to consider and to actively think about and work towards bettering. And so today, I'm really excited to have Dr. Sophia Noble with us, who's an associate professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. To give you a little bit of background on Dr. Noble before we pass it on to her, Dr. Noble is a associate professor at the University of California in the Department of Information Studies. There she serves as the co-founder and co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. Dr. Noble is the author of a best-selling book on racist and sexist algorithm biases in commercial search engines entitled Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. And her academic work also kind of focuses on this and focuses on the design of digital media platforms on the internet and their impact on society. Her work is both sociological and interdisciplinary, marking the ways that digital media impacts and intersects with issues of race, gender, culture, and technology. She is the co-editor of 2 edited volumes, The Intersectional Internet, Race, Sex, Culture, and Class Online, as well as Emotions, Technology, and Design. She currently serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies and is the co-editor of the Commentary and Criticism section of the Journal of Feminist Media Studies. In 2020, she was awarded the Distinguished Alumna Award from the iSchool Alumni Association and is also the inaugural Diversity and Inclusion Award winner from the Illinois Alumni Association at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So we're really excited to have Dr. Noble coming back here with us and sharing with us a lot of her knowledge and expertise and just really amazing information I know you all are interested in learning about. So as you're listening to Dr. Noble speak, if you have any questions that come up, if there's anything she's talking about that really piques your curiosity, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen or in the chat function and send in any questions, because at the end of the talk today, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. So Dr. Noble, I will go ahead and pass it on to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's so great to come home to Illinois, and I really wish that I were there in person with all of you because, Champaign-Urbana is our second home for our families. So many of our family members there. My beloved alma mater, obviously, the University of Illinois, and just thinking about my work existing, quite frankly, in this world because of the incredible support that I experienced when I was a graduate student in the information school at Illinois. So I just want to acknowledge and say thank you so much to the University Y for inviting me to come out and be a part of this lunchtime conversation. I'm going to talk a bit about the book because people still want to hear about the book. The book has been out for a couple of years, Algorithms of Oppression, and it feels so much longer because it started as a dissertation research project when I was a doctoral student at Illinois. And so I've been talking about this topic for a very long time, and I'm going to kind of take you a little bit on a journey, not only kind of through some of the ideas that are in the book, but also kind of where we are now. 10 years, quite frankly, almost into this conversation about whether algorithms can discriminate or not, and what the implications of that are for us going forward. So I want to kind of share with you a few headlines. I mean, this is just to set the stage. These are things that I'm sure many of you already know. You see these headlines yourself. People wrongfully accused by an algorithm where facial recognition technology, for example, mismatches with their identification markers, and people are ensnared into systems that are faulty with faulty facial recognition, faulty kind of data matching. Or, in the case of um, 2018, when the Financial Times declared techlash the word of the year, which I find to be so interesting because, the Financial Times is really the newspaper of capital in this world. I mean, it is the high finance newspaper. And so when that news outlet declares a techlash, you know that this is a huge signal, for example, to investors who are investing in this sector. And, I've been writing for a long time about the kind of arguing that technology has so much social import. And of course, one of the things that when I was a graduate student at Illinois, um, I was really invested in thinking about this. I was part of, for example, a cohort of fellows who were studying information and society, led by Dr. Linda Smith and Dr. Dan Schiller when I was there. And that was such a novel idea. In fact, there were only a handful of us. My colleague Sarah Roberts, who I co-direct the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry with, we found our way together into the same department at UCLA, and thinking about what it was like to talk about the kind of social dimensions of information or informatics. Illinois is actually one of the places where there's kind of a deep commitment to social informatics, and thinking about those things the way we did a decade ago when I was starting my work as a graduate student is so different than today. I mean, we didn't have these kinds of headlines about whether algorithms were they weren't part of the vernacular, let's put it that way. In fact, I remember when I was trying to name my book Algorithms of Oppression, and I was talking to my editor at NYU Press, and I said, I really want to name this book Algorithms of Oppression. I had brainstormed this out with a bunch of my friends from graduate school there at Illinois. And, my editor said, "Oh, Safiya, there's no way, because no one knows what an algorithm is." And I said, "Trust, they will soon." And so here we are. Looking at algorithms and AI in the headlines really now every week, certainly every month in news around the world. And this is incredibly important. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about why. Before I do that, I wanted to give you just this is a great page to take a picture or a screenshot if you're interested in these topics, especially at the intersection of race, technology, and society. There are now a number of Black scholars, and I put this slide together in June of last summer after the murder of George Floyd, as we were kind of in a global uprising, certainly in the United States, around racial justice for many, many people. So many Black Americans, African Americans who have been victims of police brutality or violence by the state. And really thinking about our role as scholars of society and technology. How could we bring some of that work to the fore, especially for people who are working in Silicon Valley, Silicon industries, corridors around the country? And so these are some people that I think are really important to know about. Some of them, going back as far back as people like Craig Watkins and Anna Everett writing about um, counter narratives of the way that we think about people of color and African Americans as we're engaged with technology. There's always been a very strong impulse to think of people of color and Black people in particular as digitally divided. And some of their early work really showed us that not only were African American teenagers or African American computer scientists and computer engineers on the ground floor of new technologies and new technology adoption, but also were, marginalized in ways that they could not necessarily intervene on kind of the course of history. And if you want to read about that, like kind of what other possibilities might have come to the fore, I highly recommend Charlton McElwain's new book, Black Software. If you're interested in these issues around what it means to live in kind of the carcerality of algorithms or technology that might um, offer different ways of thinking about how we can resist these technologies. And I certainly recommend my sister scholar, Ruha Benjamin's new book, Race After Technology. But there's really something here for everyone, too. I mean, uh, Kishana Gray with Woke Gaming, thinking about social justice and video games, and she's at your sister campus at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So she's really a great scholar and thinking critically about games and gaming. So lots of opportunities here. And one of the things that I would invite students in particular to be thinking about are the kinds of classes that you can take at Illinois and in graduate school, and thinking about graduate school at the intersection of kind of the internet or technology and society, because there's really still so much work to do. In addition to thinking about, the things that I wrote in Algorithms of Oppression, I think that there's an impulse now, and there are many more students entering this conversation where we can think about doing things like developing new fields of inquiry, whether that's kind of intersectional feminist technology studies, or thinking about intersectionality, which is really kind of a Black feminist thought and theories of society as they intersect with social media or search technologies or predictive analytics. I mean, there's really such an amazing opportunity to start thinking in much richer and more complex ways. And so these are some articles too that where I've been able to do that. And then the last kind of plug or resource that I want to share with you is there is a new and emerging field, interdisciplinary field that is coming together. And I've really been proud to be a part of gathering and working in that community, which is we gather and are kind of organized at New York University and call ourselves the kind of Critical Race and Digital Studies Center at NYU. And we have a syllabus, and our works are all up at criticalraceanddigitalstudies.com. This, again, is a number of people of color, not just African American, but broadly people of color who are thinking. Not all of them are even interested in the internet. Some of them are using digital methods. People who are digital humanists, for example, working in the digital humanities, but thinking about issues of power and race. So another just really great resource. And then I'm gonna jump into the work. All right. So this slide I want to share with you, because this is really what kind of jumped off the study that was my dissertation that eventually became the kind of lead case study in the book Algorithms of Oppression, although the book goes far beyond kind of one page of search results. It's really kind of documenting so many different kinds of failures within Google and really trying to help us understand the threat that Google is to other kinds of information and knowledge resources. So, I'm oriented just as a kind of a backdrop. I mean, in the information school that I work in at UCLA, but also that I studied in at Illinois, we're interested in these issues about um, not just kind of the generic word information, which I think is a word that often gets flattened and is not. It's a word like content that really needs to be unpacked. But we're concerned about the future of knowledge. We work in fields, librarians, archivists, um, uh, people who work in digital curation. We're thinking about a range of ways that knowledge will be preserved and made available to future generations 1,000 years from now, right? We're standing in the legacy of librarians who've been working for truly thousands of years in deciding in any given society what are the most important ideas that must persevere in service of humanity, in service of society, in service of communities. So I was oriented when I was in graduate school to thinking about search engines as a type of kind of portal to understanding or making sense of the world from this kind of knowledge perspective. And of course, at the time that I was in graduate school, we were in the throes of the Google Book Digitization Project, which was a huge project that Google had undertaken to digitize millions of volumes from libraries around the English speaking world, mostly in the United States and in Europe, and some European languages. And I was and this project really, it kind of exploded while I was in graduate school. It kind of got started, and then it also was shut down, and there was a huge lawsuit, and the project was halted. And I was thinking about what does it mean that kind of a commercial search engine and a company that was at the time really known for search was interested in not only digitizing all the world's knowledge, which is kind of what their claim was, but that they were also so profoundly misrepresenting people and communities and different forms of knowledge. So this is a result from 2011, and this is on the keywords Black girls. And I was thinking about my daughter at the time. My stepdaughter is a student at Illinois right now who's graduating this year from media and cinema studies. And I was thinking about her and my nieces and, what might happen if they were on the internet and, Googling for Black girls. But I was also thinking because I had been a Black girl at one time in my life um, and knowing what I knew about information retrieval, even in library databases, people tend to use just a few keywords, and so the ideas that are represented by the fewest number of keywords is very, very important. And this is something for us all. This is just kind of a crash course on what you need to know about searching for information. And I was stunned. Now these were there was kind of similar results 2010, 2011. It wasn't until the fall of 2012 that Google actually started to suppress the pornography, which is mostly what you see here, are kind of porn sites or hypersexualized sites. But when you did these searches, you didn't have to add the word sex or you didn't have to add the word porn. Black girls just became synonymous with pornography or hypersexualized content. And this, still unfortunately holds true for Asian girls and Latino girls. And so I continue to write about what happens to women and girls of color in search engines and how minoritized communities really lose control of our own identity markers, of the ways in which we are represented in these spaces. And of course, I think so much is at stake as search engines increasingly encroach upon the information landscape and the public turns away from more complex information spaces and institutions like libraries, for example, and moves to these more kind of instantaneous, instant gratification spaces like search. I've written about this kind of phenomenon since then, and I think it's a place to keep our eyes on. Certainly, Google has intervened. I mean, I think for those of us who write critically about technology companies, one thing that we find is that almost assuredly, with as soon as our books come out, or our articles, or for journalists when their stories come out, those companies take those kind of documents, right, or the documentation of the harm that we have found. And that's like a big book of tickets. If you work in a tech company, you know that a ticket is kind of like what you open to document how you're fixing and resolving a technical issue. So, I wrote a big book of tickets for Google, and they certainly have attempted to work on many of those things. But still, I think there's still new things and new problems that emerge. Now, one of the challenges here is that, and this is one of the reasons why I really, my first 2 years of my career, I spent as an assistant professor at Illinois, 1 year in African American studies and 1 year in media and cinema studies. And I'll tell you that one of the things that I love about media studies scholars is they really help us understand how to read and interpret cultural artifacts or social artifacts or media. So these ideas about the hypersexualized Black girl, have been with us for a very, very long time. They've really been with us for centuries. And so sometimes people will argue with me, well, Safiya, the reason why those kinds of racist and sexist images of girls of color uh, emerge at the top of search is because that's what's most popular. That's what people are looking for. And of course, I'm really unwilling to concede that when girls of color are looking for themselves, that's what they're looking for, that they're looking for these kind of racist and derogatory stereotypes about themselves, or when their families are looking for that kind of information, or their friends. What we have instead is really the interplay of industries who are able to spend the most on search engine optimization, and Google's kind of backbone that drives search, which is who is willing to pay the most in a 24/7 live AdWords auction. In order to help drive their ideas, their advertisements, quite frankly. And then the advertisements really help link to, well, what type of websites match or make sense in relationship to those ads. So this is really what's happening in these spaces. People will also often argue that search is just a matter of kind of what's most popular. And if this then opens the question to what happens when you are then not in the majority in a society. And we've seen so many harms come to minoritized communities through digital technologies. And so I think this is a really important logic that we're going to have to apprehend and deal with too, which is about fair representation. Now, in the past, as you look at these kinds of images here's old images, these kind of, racist stereotypes about Black women in our society. One of the things we know is we have a lot more sense of the subjectivity of these kinds of racist images in society. When these images are created and they circulate, they represent clearly a point of view that is quite unidirectional. If you see these kinds of images, for example, in old Hollywood, you understand them in early Hollywood as, made in a studio, made by a director, um, paid for and distributed by, again, a Hollywood studio. And those are not received in the same way, that media is not received in the same way as something you would look for or find in a search engine. And part of the challenge here is because when people engage with search engines, they think that they are using something much more akin to a fact checker or to a truth teller, or to, they think they're engaging with a technology that is sorting through millions of possibilities and bringing the very best ideas to the top of the search pile, to the front page. And one of the things we know, for example, from the information retrieval literature, is that most people do not go past the first page of results. This is true even in the library. And so these are things that we have to contend with about the way in which media is presented to us as knowledge or as reliable information, as is the case many times in search. Now, um, if you're if you don't have time to read the book and kind of spend some time with these ideas, I think that there's a really good excerpt of the book at Wired magazine, and this is kind of what the front page of that looks like. And one of the things that I'm arguing in the book is that, we think about the injustices in our society, racial, social, political, economic inequality, and that there's an app or a technology that's going to help solve for that. I mean, this is really the prevailing idea, is that in silicon corridors around the world, that technology is going to solve our social problems, our economic and our unjust social practices. And one of the things I try to share in that excerpt is that at the very moment that we in the United States, for example, passed the Civil Rights Act, in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and we have a modicum of participation by people of color in decision making positions in society. And I mean, we just barely begin to scratch the surface. Of course, we still know profoundly that in places like academia, for example, where I work, that Black women are profoundly discriminated against and are the lowest paid, the most overserviced and overworked, right, and the most likely to face discrimination um, in a variety of different ways. So we've just begun to scratch the surface 50 years into the civil rights, the kind of post civil rights movement, relative to hundreds of years of oppression, legal and social oppression, and um, and yet as we start to have these openings for participation in reimagining our society and power relations in our society, we also see the rise of a belief in technology and computing in particular to make better decisions than we can. And I find this to be incredibly um, challenging for us as a society, as like kind of not marrying up and looking more broadly, kind of historically, at how this idea that computers can make better decisions than human beings at the moment that we start to have women and people of color participate more meaningfully in decision making. Um, and those who are really who dominate the computing industries are not women and historically underrepresented minorities, African Americans, Latinos, Indigenous people, Asian Pacific Islander. So these are the kind of complexities that I think are before us. And I think there's a huge, I mean, we're just at the beginning of starting to think critically about how we're going to imagine a whole variety of technologies becoming a proxy and standing in for human decision making. And I think these are the kinds of things that I'm really concerned about. I wrote a piece during COVID just a few months ago, last summer, about the loss of public goods to big tech. And one of the things that I've seen, for example, is the crisis facing higher education, K through 12, the crisis facing public libraries. Again, I'm so committed to these kinds of knowledge institutions, these educational spaces. And one of the things that we see, for example, is that during this time of COVID-19, the only industry that's truly been thriving while 40 to 60 million Americans have been unemployed has been the tech sector. And I think that it's something that we need to really pay attention to. I mean, I encourage those, those who watch this webinar to be thinking about this kind of in your own local spaces, looking at the distribution of resources. How is budgeting happening in your city, in your organization, in your university, and in your school districts? One of the things we see in California is that here we are in the heart of Silicon Beach, I live right down the street from Silicon Beach, and Silicon Valley is just up the road a few hours. And here we are in the epicenter of the kind of the one of the, certainly California being the technology capital of the United States. And our universities and our schools and our libraries are in crisis. So, what we see here is tech companies who do not pay taxes, for example, into the coffers, into the public coffers, who offshore their profits rather than reinvesting those profits back into California in the United States. And by taking that capital out of the system, and letting the public subsidize their work through tax evasion, through research and development lab partnerships with universities in California. And of course, this happens around the country at big research universities. Those research and development, kind of those risky technology endeavors, are often subsidized by the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes for Health, or kind of federal funding agencies that are public dollars. So that kind of the riskiest research gets kind of offloaded onto the public. And then the investment or the returns never come back to the public. And what we see in California, for example, is new markets being opened up by the crisis of the lack of resources in the system. We're now, I think, approaching a moment where we have to see that to get a degree at a place like UCLA is incredibly expensive. You could certainly spend $100,000 getting a bachelor's degree at a place like UCLA or Berkeley, when you add housing, required on-campus housing and these kinds of things. So the question is, how is it that this sector, with all of its promise, its alleged promise, is actually profoundly implicated in weakening our democratic institutions? One of the things I often, and so this is where I see the loss of public goods, these institutions that really belong to democratic societies, and the way in which they're weakened by this sector and these industries. And then, though that very sector comes in and offers all of the kind of tech solutions to keep the universities and schools propped up. And this, of course, has been one of the crises. We could ask ourselves how many of us would have ever used Zoom, for example, had it not been for COVID-19. And so I think these are the kinds of things that are at stake, of course, along with our privacy and what is to be lost from having to engage in so much of our human activity through these systems that are also tracking us and collecting data about us while we use them. So as I begin to close here, and I hope that you'll have questions and you'll add them to the chat, I'd love to talk to you. I'm thinking about, for future work, now about how do we create a paradigm shift? How do we introduce new conversations and reimagine the future of the kinds of societies that we want to live in? There's a huge emphasis on reimagining technology right now, but I think the question is really, how do we reimagine society? For every year that we've been documenting global economic inequality, for example, each year we eclipse the year prior. Global social and economic inequality is rising. It's becoming more entrenched. I think the UK House of Lords, about 2.5 years ago or so, issued a study, and they projected that by 2030, the top 1% of the world's wealth holders would own 2/3 of the world's wealth. 2/3, that's incredible. So when you think about the direction we're headed in, we certainly have to have a paradigm shift. And I think we see this in other spaces like climate crisis, right? Well, how do we, induce a paradigm shift that would ensure things like the future of humanity or the future of Earth and its inhabitants in a way that is not so profoundly degraded? So I'm looking to and studying now other big moments where a handful of people relative to the population have really been able to create a shift. And of course, the era of big cotton is a place to learn, what was it about abolitionists working to end the transatlantic slave trade and then persistently work another 150 years to end the institution of slavery in the United States. You think about how many millions of people just went about their daily business while in the enslavement of African peoples was normalized wholly as a way of life. And people, in fact, argued that you could not dismantle slavery as an institution because it would destroy the US economy. And these are the very similar kinds of arguments we hear about technology, in fact, right now. That it's just too deeply embedded into every industry, and so we can't make changes that we so I think desperately need. I also think about more recently the era of big tobacco because when I was born, I'm sure that the doctor who delivered me had a cigarette hanging out of, I can't even do a cigarette because I don't know how to smoke, um, had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. And I'm pretty sure my mom probably chain smoked 2 packs of cigarettes while she was in the hospital bed. For anybody who's from the 70s or the 80s, we know that that was incredibly, or before, um, normal kind of practice. So, what is it that, and of course, big tobacco, not only did many of their executives and consultants move right on over to help big tech and work as lobbyists for big tech, but we know that people who worked, for example, around big tobacco propped up multi-million dollar research labs at universities and other places to produce pseudoscience that would back up the interests of big tobacco. And of course, my students now at UCLA, they just can't believe the things that I'm saying about what smoking was like when I was their age. But we've created a paradigm shift around big tobacco. And I think that we can learn a lot from these two different eras about this era of big tech that we are living in now. So, what are some things that we can do? I mean, I think these are always things that colleagues, for example, for colleagues at Illinois who are potentially watching this, I mean, one of the things I think we really need is that we need to bring these kind of critical social, political, and economic research theories and methods into the agenda setting work around big tech. When I was a graduate student, I can remember saying that I wanted to use theories like critical race theory and Black feminism to help me better understand and research Google. And, if it were not for the, you know, incredible insight and support of people like Dr. Linda Smith, who was my advisor at Illinois, it would have been quite difficult, if not impossible, to bring forward these theories and epistemologies into the study of technology and information systems. So having that kind of foresight was so incredible. But that needs to be made normative. We need more faculty and researchers and kind of interdisciplinary possibilities for research that really bring the knowledge from Black studies and ethnic studies into information work. I think we need to also integrate kind of science and technology studies into ethnic studies. And we're just now, I mean, it's been so amazing to be a part of, sitting on dozens now of dissertation committees over the last 8 or 9 years and seeing students come into this work. And now there are jobs getting posted for people who do this kind of work. And so it's really an exciting time to enter this field. And I think we're just at the beginning. We obviously need to hire people who have PhDs in sociology, in ethnic studies, in gender studies, in Black studies to work in tech companies alongside software engineers. And they need to have the same kind of power and influence that while the veracity of the technology might be getting vetted by the computer engineers. What about the veracity of the impact of this on society? And people who study society need to be at the table, powerfully advocating also maybe that some technologies cannot come into existence and should be shelved. And so this is very important. And then I think, ultimately we need funding and resources to create these centers of excellence and action that are visible to industry and academia, the public. I'm really grateful that we've been supported by the Minderoo Foundation at UCLA, Professor Roberts and I, to create one of these centers of excellence and to be a bit of an outpost or a place where people who are interested in these issues can come and study with us. And we work with lots of partners and sit at the table with many, many different kinds of partners, community organizations, feminist, AI collectives, foundations, and so forth. And so really there's just a great, I think this is a great time to enter into these conversations. The last thing I'll say here, this is my last slide, is that, we were made these promises about what technology, digital technology in particular, could do for us. And one of the things that I say in this book is that we have more data and technology than ever. But see, we also have more social, political, and economic inequality and injustice to go with it. And so what is it about the kind of the contradictions between the promises and the realities that we are living through and living in, and how might we reimagine and reshape? Might it be possible that the more data and the more technology we have, the more it is implicated in the sorting and classifying and predicting of people in and out of opportunities? We know that the future of predictive analytics is here with us. And of course, search for me is one of those early predictive kinds of technologies that now we see working at every level of housing, hiring, access to healthcare, access to financial products, access to mortgages, bank loans, um, predictive analytics playing a role in college admissions. I mean, there's so many dimensions and facets of our life where these kinds of technologies are being deployed, and we also see the mounting evidence of the harm and the discrimination that is embedded into those technologies. And so these, I think, are the questions before us. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share my work with you. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Noble. Very, very amazing work you're doing and really interesting conversation. I know we have a lot of questions already, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. Also, for anybody who's watching on Facebook, I know we have a few people watching. Feel free to type your questions in those comments and we'll try to get to those as well. But we could go ahead and kick off with this first one that we have in our Q&A. So Natalie asks, what would you advocate what would you advocate change in terms of public university funding for library science as a response to these very important issues you raise?
Yeah, I mean, my number one recommendation when I'm talking to policymakers, who obviously are also responsible for municipal, state, and federal budgets, is that you cannot just I mean, I obviously am a person who is on the regulatory side of the aisle in terms of experts who are brought in to testify and share about the harmful impact of technology and how we need greater oversight. And I also say that you cannot just regulate these companies and defund all of our democratic institutional counterweights. So if you defund libraries, if you defund universities and schools, museums, archives, community archives, you have no democratic institutional counterweights. You just have nothing. And in the absence of having robust, libraries and information spaces, and I'll tell you, one of the things that Sarah and I are working on at UCLA right now is we're working on a grant to try and cultivate a pilot study in internet librarianship for example, public internet librarianship. What would it like to have would be like to have more public internet and less of this kind of commercial internet, which is what we experience, and have librarians who can help the public? Because in the absence of what might be like a reference librarian that you experience in the library in your internet spaces, um, people will scaffold up and make up their own information systems. And so this is where I look at the work of people like Dr. Stacy Wood at UCLA, and one of our graduate students, Sarah's graduate students, Yvonne Eden, both of whom study conspiracy theories and conspiracy theory systems. And what we know is that, for example, when people are looking for information and knowledge and they can't get behind the paywall to evidence-based research, which is behind academic paywalls. I mean, the only people who really get that are people who work in universities and colleges. In the absence, in their seeking of that kind of information and knowledge, when they can't find it, they will build their own robust archives and knowledge systems with anything they can find. And of course, this is really fundamentally at the heart of how many kinds of disinformation and conspiracy theory driven systems emerge. And then when people are using something like a search engine, they're often led right to those places because the knowledge is actually inaccessible. So we're going to have to reconcile that this is the reality that we're living in, and we absolutely need tremendous funding. If I were a university president, I would be putting a tremendous amount of resource into funding information schools and library science programs and building the next generation of people to go into information work, because it is actually one of the most crucial dimensions of what we need for a thriving democracy.
Awesome.
Nobody wants to make me university president, though, so it's fine, leave it.
We have a question from Chibundo on Facebook, and she says, or they say, I think a lot about how sex, specifically curbing sex work and or trafficking, general sexual indecency, is used as a reason to extend surveillance and displacement processes on the internet. After SESTA/FOSTA and the coming Earn It Act, we see how sex is being used for the weakening of Section 230 of the CDA, anti-encryption and anti-open source tech law, and prohibit content moderation on social media. As you've pointed out, marginalized people are inherently sexual within how these algorithms and laws see us. And so the policing of sex always affects marginalized people. Could you speak about the confluence of respectability, politics, and surveillance capitalism towards extending oppressive algorithms, or even how deploying respectability politics can produce public buy-in for oppressive algorithms?
Yeah, I mean, we need to have a whole conference on this question, these questions that have been raised, because they are crucial. In fact, we just entered into a new relationship with AI Now, which is a really great think tank at NYU. So we're kind of in partnership with them, and have just hired a person who is doing an incredible amount of research around sex workers and SESTA FOSTA. And I think there will be some new research coming out in the coming year about exactly what you're talking about, which is, if you look, and this is one of the things that I was really interested in after I wrote Algorithms of Oppression, because, really, I wasn't interested in arguing against sex workers, right? And there were a lot of people, as I was writing the book, some of the reviewers who really wanted me to write about like the history of pornography and sex work, which are not the same entirely. And, I felt that there were others like Murray Miller Young at UC Santa Barbara, who had this incredible book called The Taste of Brown Sugar that was just coming out, that was about the history of Black women in pornography. Um, and and there are others like Patrick Kelty at the University of Toronto, who's written about sex workers and the way in which technology companies have really, really punished and penalized sex workers. through exactly what you're talking about, just kind of like standing behind the shield of, not just respectability politics, but certainly that's a part of it, like their brand management, image management, so that, companies like PayPal and Google will not allow their platforms to be used by sex workers, but then they will, a company like Google will turn right around and make huge profits off of the amplification of the commodification of women of color. So here we see this contradiction where they are willing to make plenty of money off of the exploitation, and taking money from the porn industry, but the workers, they will penalize and suppress and not allow to use their technologies. So this is a very, very complicated and interesting, super interesting area. And I think that Section 230 obviously is a policy where we need reform. I think we do, because the platforms are really able to get away with profiting from hate and disinformation and propaganda and have no culpability or responsibility for what happens. And of course, this is where white supremacists organize to, not just take over the US Capitol, but to terrorize Black, Muslim, Jewish communities all over the country. So we know we need to figure out what the platforms are doing algorithmically and around content moderation. And we know that what they're already doing comes at the expense of people of color and vulnerable people and vulnerable workers. And part of how we see that, for example, is in the way in which, even in their content moderation practices, they are, and this is where I think about my colleague Sarah's work, how, there's incredible profitability off of allowing, you know, treacherous things to enter the field of visibility and to be amplified, while people who are also working against that are put in Twitter jail, right? Or their accounts are suspended. Or if you make visible that you're being trolled by racists, you get shut down rather than the racists, right? So there's a lot happening here, and I think that many ways that you slice it, the most vulnerable are left holding the bag with the short end of the stick over and over and over again. We see this, and this is why this research is really important. And I really love the question, and I wish I had more time to just sit and talk about it. But I think your analysis is right.
We have another question from Sarah, who says that they're a first-year student in the MS-LIS program, and says they're interested in what librarians can do in their work to make an impact. What kinds of conversations do you have with colleagues about LIS and their role in the work? And do you even meet resistance from librarians who may think that the ideas of algorithm bias fall outside of the scope of their work?
Well, I mean, my crew are the librarians. I've been so supported by librarians all over this country and have been invited to speak at all the major library conferences and to share about my work and do a lot of engagement. So I think there's an appetite. If you look at, for example, ACRL this year, that was a group that took very seriously Black Lives Matter and what's happening in the world, and wants to figure out what is the role of librarians in bringing about and fostering better knowledge and information sharing to address issues of racial injustice. So I think our field, though there are pockets of people who are resistant to these conversations, like in any field, I think our field has tended to be really powerfully engaged. I would add that there are still so many challenges that we face in fostering open access, right? Greater access to research for the public. Figuring out what our roles are in relationship to big, scholarly publishing houses. There's a lot of work still for librarians to do, and one of the things that I also think about is how could we harness the skill set of librarians to help us think about navigating the open web And this is still like a thing everywhere I go. When I talk to librarians, I say, don't you want to work on indexing and curating the open web too, with all of these incredible skills that you have about understanding, like, reliable resources, and, your ability to vet and then tie to bigger sets of, collections of books and, and ideas, right? Deepening rather than like keeping the public out in these more shallow spaces. So I think there's a lot to do. And I think those are the conversations that librarians are having. And I hope that you will be able to participate in those and find your people. There are pockets, I've always followed kind of the hashtag CritLib on Twitter, because I find that that's where a lot of like critically oriented and people with a power analysis librarians are hanging out and finding each other and writing and doing work. And I really invite you to get into that space too.
We have a kind of clarifying question. So I think early in your conversation or your presentation, you were talking about big companies like Google and Facebook and Apple, and talking about like taxes and tax breaks they may face. And so Thomas was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, or just kind of clarify, are you saying that those companies don't pay taxes? And if so, what kind of taxes are they and why are they not paying those?
Yeah, for the most part, those companies pay very, very little in taxes. Or in the case of Apple, a few years ago, they were getting tax refunds, which is just stunning to me to think about. So yeah, I mean, there are plenty of consumer watchdog organizations that are watching, what we think of as like the big six tech companies, and are have been protesting their lack of tax filings in the U.S. and Europe. And their use of like tax havens in places like Ireland and other parts of the world. So I would say this is pretty easy to find. The Guardian has written several articles also about tax evasion by big tech companies. So I would say, definitely go read on that, because it's fascinating and distressing. We also see that kind of play out at less visible ways, like not so much federal taxes, but um, municipal tax breaks. So in San Francisco, for example, I used to live in the Bay Area for a long time, and the you know the zoning kinds of tax breaks. So if you move into, a low income area, um, then you get a tax break, at the municipal level, paid local taxes. This is how SOMA, the whole South of Market area in San Francisco, which when I lived in the Bay was like, you know, and now it's like booming and, gourmet, but it didn't used to be. And part of that is because that area was like identified as a place where, to attract tech companies to come and, headquarter or put offices.
I know we're running a little short on time, but I think
Okay.
this would be a great question to kind of end everything with. Natalie asked, do you see coalitions with private sector actors, with tech companies as being part of the solution?
I think that that might be possible with smaller companies who aren't the biggest players. Uh, for reasons that I don't have a lot of time left, but I'll say that there have been some really interesting things to learn from, let's say, a second tier under the big companies. So, for example, Airbnb, I think about them and the role they played, and how they partnered with the Anti-Defamation League and the NAACP and several civil rights organizations post Charlottesville and the murder of people, I mean, the kind of violence, white supremacist violence, and, the death of Heather Heyer, and how Airbnb, for example, saw white supremacists booking and noting in their bookings like that they didn't want to uh, book a house that was owned by Black people, right? Or that like they were seeing things that were happening as people were booking housing to come in and descend on Charlottesville. And, they notified the authorities, and they were one of the, companies to get in front. I think about Cloudflare. and how they have deplatformed thousands of Nazis, and have just declared those aren't our values as a company. So yes, I think that the smaller, let's say mid-tier companies are really trying to do some interesting things and taking responsibility differently. And I think that there are partnerships to be had and things to learn from what they're doing. They put themselves at risk when they do that too. And it's an incredibly difficult position when no one else in the industry is doing it. So there's a lot of work to do. I don't think that these issues will be led by industry. I think industry is leading us in the wrong direction. I think it'll be civil, human, and sovereign rights organizations that really should be setting the agenda and putting the brakes on some of the ideas coming out of industry.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Noble, for being here with us today and really helping us just like critically consider a lot of these really, really important issues. It was fascinating to hear your insights and really think about this a little bit more. And I encourage everyone to look into a lot of the resources that you shared with us, because I know I wrote some down, so I'm very excited to be able to get into them a little bit more. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you for everyone who joined us on Zoom, for anyone who joined us on Facebook. And if you enjoyed this conversation and want to continue getting involved, next Friday, our Friday Forum will be with Daniel Gonzalez, who is a PhD candidate at U of I, and he's going to be talking about how data is used in immigrant surveillance in particular. So really amazing conversation, and really excited to continue those. So thank you again, Dr. Noble. Thank you to everyone who's here, and hope you all have a good rest of your Friday.